Hey guys, tonight we step into a story that flickers like a flame against the dark backdrop of the Aegean. Imagine the island of Chios just off the coast of Asia Minor, where hills roll down toward the sea, and the scent of resin and salt drifts through the air. On this island for centuries, people whispered about a fire that never went out. Not the hearth fire of a single family, and not the carefully guarded embers of a blacksmith's forge, but a flame that seemed to draw its breath from the earth itself. Travellers described it as both terrifying and comforting, a beacon in the night, and a reminder that nature sometimes has a sense of drama that puts any emperor's parade to shame. And just so you know, if you ever stumble onto a place like this without a plan, you probably won't survive the fumes, much less the gossip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little campfire of ours can reach across the world. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Chios begins in layers like the soft folds of parchment. Ancient writers describe the island as lush, famed for its mastic trees, whose resin-flavoured drinks sweetened breath and even sealed wounds. But among the orchards and vineyards was something stranger, a patch of earth where fire refused to die. The Greeks, never ones to miss a chance for mythology, linked such marvels to the gods. If flames licked out of the soil, surely Hephaestus, the lame god of fire and forge, had touched it. Or perhaps Apollo, who demanded offerings in bright flame, left a spark behind. The locals themselves treated it with reverence, a paradoxical blend of caution and pride. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor us. Natural eternal flames often arise from underground gas vents, especially in areas where tectonic plates shift and release methane. Chios lies along a restless seam of the earth, where volcanic and seismic activity shaped not just landscapes, but imaginations. To the ancient eye, however, this was not chemistry but divinity. Fire emerging from bare rock became a message, and messages demanded interpretation. Historians still argue whether the so-called eternal fire of Chios was a literal geological phenomenon like the famous burning hillside at Yanatash in Turkey, or whether it was more a cultural story kept alive because the idea of an immortal flame was simply too powerful to discard. Some scholars point to scattered references in Byzantine chronicles, others to travellers' notes from the medieval period, each suggesting that people indeed saw flames, or at least believed they did. But frustratingly, the evidence dances like firelight itself, never still, never letting us pin it down. Picture it a shepherd leading his flock across rocky pastures at dusk, the sea dimming to slate when he notices a shimmer of flame trembling out of the earth. The sheep balk their bells, jangling like nervous laughter, while the shepherd mutters a prayer. Perhaps he leaves an offering olive oil, a scrap of bread, a whisper of thanks, because who risks offending a god's campfire? By morning he tells the story in the marketplace, and the story grows faster than vines in spring. Quirky tales naturally attach themselves. One rumour claimed that sailors used the fire as a navigational beacon, steering their ships toward the faint glow on stormy nights. Another, less credible but endlessly amusing, suggested that Chian bakers saved money on wood by bringing dough up the hillside and setting it near the eternal flame, effectively letting the gods bake the bread. Imagine waiting for your loaf while a priest mutters that Apollo himself is the chef. Suddenly stale crusts sound exciting. The symbolism of the eternal fire took root across centuries. In Greek thought, fire was life and continuity. The sacred flame of Hestia burned in every polis, never allowed to go out, symbolizing the survival of the community. Chios's natural flame seemed like nature's endorsement of that sacred practice. If cities needed priests to guard their fires here, the earth itself played priest, and that to a culture that cherished omens was almost too good to be true. By the medieval period, travellers and monks carried the memory of the Chian flame into broader legends. Pilgrims passing through the Aegean whispered about its persistence, linking it to other mysterious fires across the Mediterranean. Theologians debated whether such a fire was divine favour or a demonic trick, a literal hellmouth peeking through the soil. Imagine the debates in candlelit monasteries, one monk insisting it was proof of God's majesty, another muttering darkly that it was a temptation meant to lure the faithful. Both probably agreed on one thing: no one should roast lamb over it, however convenient. The eternal fire became a metaphor too. To some, it symbolized the endurance of the Greek spirit, a flame that would not be snuffed out despite empires rising and falling. To others, it warned of hubris, that the earth could burn forever, uncaring of human need. The tension between reverence and fear lingers in every retelling. As the centuries rolled on, the fire flickered in memory, even if its physical presence dimmed. Some reports insisted it still burned faintly in certain caves or hillsides, others that it had gone out but lived on in song. Historians still argue whether its disappearance was due to shifting geology, lack of fuel, or simply a fading of local storytelling traditions. Yet the absence of certainty has only deepened the allure. A known fire is mundane, a maybe fire is immortal, and so the story of Chios's eternal flame sets the stage. It is not just about heat or light, but about imagination. Flames illuminate, but they also cast shadows, and in those shadows people saw gods, demons, portents, and hope. The shepherd's startled flock, the baker's cheeky bread, the sailor's desperate beacon, all flicker together into a single tapestry. What burned on Chios was more than gas. It was curiosity itself igniting century after century. The fire burns on not only in the imagination but in the land itself. Across the rugged island of Chios, where olive groves cling to hillsides, and the Aegean air carries a briny tang, a peculiar flame has whispered through centuries. It is not a grand bonfire nor a tidy hearth. It is something stranger, a slow, persistent exhalation of the earth itself rising through cracks in rock and soil, glowing steadily like a lantern that never runs out of oil. Travellers describe it with awe, villagers with familiarity, and scholars with a nervous shuffle of papers. They all agree on one thing: it should not be possible for a flame to survive this long-fed, by no visible fuel, in a place where storms lash and winds howl, and yet there it is. The story takes shape in early accounts. Ancient geographers who mapped the Aegean noted curious fires across the wider region, but Chios's flame stood out. Strabo, the peripatetic chronicler, writes of eternal fires on certain coasts fueled perhaps by unseen vapours. Some modern historians cite this as evidence that natural gas deposits or petroleum seepages were known long before we gave them scientific names. Imagine a villager in a russet cloak tossing a branch into the glow and seeing it crackle without dimming the original flame. He would have called it sacred, not geological. Mainstream fact, Chios, famed for its wine and mastic resin, also earned a quiet reputation for harbouring a fire that seemed to need no tending. But of course, the earth is never simple. The quirky tidbit comes from local folklore. Goats grazing near the flame were said to grow either exceptionally fat or absurdly thin, depending on who told the story. Some villagers swore that the vapours nourished the animals, others muttered that invisible demons sapped their strength. You can almost picture the shepherds arguing while their goats chewed indifferently. Historians still argue whether these tales were sincere observations of livestock behaviour or just excuses for a bad season's pasture. Either way, the fire became a backdrop for endless rustic storytelling. The continuity of the flame meant it attracted more than shepherds. Sailors pulling into Chios's harbours heard of it and climbed the hills to see it themselves. Imagine men hardened by months at sea suddenly quiet, as they stood before a patch of earth that glowed as if it were alive. In an age when gods controlled storms, disease and fortune, a self-sustaining flame felt like nothing less than a message. Some left offerings, bits of bread, a small amphora of wine, a few bronze coins. If the fire accepted, perhaps Poseidon would grant calm seas. If it flared unexpectedly well, someone in the crew probably skipped their prayers. Scholarly speculation has never ceased. One theory suggests that the flame of Chios is linked to the same kind of natural gas vents seen in other parts of the world, like the Anatash in Lycia, where fire has danced for millennia. In those cases, methane leaks from the crust and ignites, spontaneously needing no human hand to maintain it. Could Chios have its own subterranean gas pocket? Or does the geology of the island, famous for its marble and volcanic soil, hide something more complex? Historians still argue whether the fire has always been in the same location, or whether villagers quietly moved it over generations, relighting it from the original, whenever the earth's breath shifted. The flame also slipped into ritual. Chian families, some say, carried torches lit from the eternal fire during festivals, claiming the light purified their processions. Weddings might borrow a flicker of it to bless a new household hearth, the way candles today sometimes pass from hand to hand at midnight services. Was this truly tradition, or later invention? Hard to say. But it made the flame not only a curiosity, but a participant in daily life, a kind of glowing neighbour who never spoke yet always watched. The politics of empire ensured even emperors heard whispers of it. Roman administrators, ever eager to catalogue resources, noted Chios' flame in their scrolls, though they could not decide if it was an asset or a nuisance. After all, anything that burned eternally suggested power, and power had to be controlled. One report even proposed fencing it off lest locals claim divine authority through its presence. But fencing fire is like bottling wind, a task doomed from the start, and here the imagination drifts toward the fantastical. Some medieval chroniclers embroidered the tale until the fire was said to glow with the faces of the lost or to hum faintly like a choir. Was this exaggeration poetic fancy, or the attempt of sleepless monks to explain strange noises in the night? Historians still argue whether these accounts point to genuine observations of shifting gas flames, or simply the human tendency to add drama when retelling mysteries by candlelight. Through all of this, the flame's persistence remains its most unnerving feature. Storms swept the island, empires rose and collapsed. Crusaders passed through, with banners flapping, and yet the fire endured. Imagine a Byzantine soldier pausing to warm his hands before it, unaware he stood in the same glow that once startled a Roman sailor. Imagine a villager in saffron robes whispering a prayer as Ottoman patrols marched nearby, the fire flickering behind them, as if unimpressed by human conquest. And still the fire does not speak, it simply burns. Perhaps that is the core of its mystery. It neither demands nor explains, but it invites. Anyone who looks into its glow feels that tug of wonder, that mixture of comfort and unease. The same feeling you might get staring at a campfire at night, realizing that while sparks fade quickly, the dark remains infinite. The fire on Chios is no longer a small shy flame tucked into a lonely crevice. By this point in the tale, it is an open presence in the island's rhythm, a feature as familiar as the salt wind that rakes across vineyards, or the bleating of goats carried on the slopes. Imagine standing on a ridge at dusk, the sky bruises purple. The Aegean sighs below, and there halfway up a hill that looks unremarkable in daylight, a shimmer of light keeps flickering long after the sun has bowed out. Travellers pause, rub their eyes, and wonder if they are watching torches or lanterns left behind. Yet it is neither. The flame is steady, loyal, and eerily self-possessed. In a world where darkness usually swallowed everything after sunset, such a sight left people uneasy. They whispered that it was not a flame at all, but a reminder that the gods still claimed real estate on the island. One mainstream fact anchors this scene. Chios in antiquity was not some anonymous rock, but a thriving maritime hub. Its wines were praised in Athens, its ships traded across the Aegean, and its poets even found homes in distant courts. To live on Chios meant to live within reach of the great conversations of the Greek world. That made the presence of an eternal flame more than a local oddity. Merchants carried news of it to harbours far away, and sailors swapped stories of the fire between cups of watered wine. You think your city has wonders, one might say. On Chios, the ground burns of its own accord. The ground itself seemed complicit. Shepherds noticed that the earth near the flame was warm underfoot even on cold mornings. Fishermen returning late swore that smoke clung low as if reluctant to leave. Children dared each other to run past the flame at night, and though nothing leapt out, they often claimed their dreams afterward were crowded with restless figures. Historians still argue whether the fire was caused by natural gas vents seeping through cracks in the earth, or by ancient human hands deliberately feeding it with hidden fuel. The scientific answer remains elusive, but the psychological effect is easy to understand. The fire felt like a line between human and divine had been blurred. Quirky tidbits surface in later retellings. One suggests that local priests used the flame to cook offerings, insisting that the gods preferred bread singed by eternal fire, rather than by ordinary hearths. Another insists that sailors carried small embers away in clay pots, hoping to transplant the blessing to their own hearths at home. If true, this would make the Chios flame a kind of export, a spiritual souvenir, alongside amphorae of wine and jars of olives. Picture a tired sailor staggering into a distant port, balancing not only his cargo, but also a carefully shielded ember, muttering at every gust of wind to behave. You can almost hear his shipmates mocking him, until of course the ember survived the trip and gave him bragging rights at the tavern. The presence of the flame also shaped rituals. Festivals on Chios often blended the ordinary with the uncanny, and processions sometimes included stops at the eternal fire. Young girls in saffron robes would scatter laurel leaves around the edges, while boys with russet cloaks carried baskets of bread and figs to leave nearby. The fire consumed nothing directly, but the offerings once set down were later gone. Were they taken by priests, animals, or something less visible? No one ever admitted, and the ambiguity itself added to the fire's mystique. Humour, of course, has its place. One local story has a farmer who grew so frustrated with the constant talk of the flame that he tried to douse it with a jug of goat's milk. According to the tale, the milk hissed, curdled instantly, and left the fire untouched. The man, embarrassed, stomped away, muttering that the gods must simply enjoy a good dairy snack. Centuries later, islanders still chuckled at the image of divine beings sipping milk froth from a flame. The joke lightened the dread, because after all you cannot live in constant awe without occasionally poking fun. Travellers from outside the island brought their own interpretations. Some compared the Chios fire to the eternal flame of Hephaestus in Athens, suggesting that the god of fire and forge kept multiple workshops scattered across Greece. Others tied it to Prometheus, arguing that the Titan still punished for gifting fire to mortals let stray embers fall here as reminders of his theft. The islanders nodded politely but carried on with their own rituals. Outsiders always brought theories, but locals still had to herd goats and press olives. At the same time, scholars in later eras pored over fragmentary mentions of the fire. One papyrus brittle as old bark hints that Chios was famous for a flame that knows no master. Another, etched in stone near a crumbling shrine, depicts a stylized torch beside waves, as though the island itself was branded by fire. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions refer to the same phenomenon, or whether later storytellers stitched unrelated scraps into a single legend. The lack of consistent detail drives them mad, which, if you think about it, might be the fire's most enduring trick. Night remains the flame's stage. Imagine again a quiet evening, the sea's pulse tapping the rocks, cicadas winding down their chorus, stars pricking the sky, and then without fanfare the glow of the eternal fire flickers. For weary farmers it promised continuity, for anxious sailors it promised protection, for children it promised nightmares worth bragging about. Everyone saw what they needed. That is the power of ambiguity. The flame could be a divine beacon, a scientific curiosity, or just a stubborn quirk of geology. And in a way, each explanation burned side by side just like the flame itself. Yet the longer the fire endured, the heavier its shadow grew. Rumours spread that as long as the flame burned, Chios would prosper, but if it ever dimmed, famine or invasion would follow. People began to watch it obsessively, scanning for signs of weakness. Was the glow fainter tonight? Did the smoke curl differently? Human beings are experts at noticing patterns, even where none exist, and the flame offered plenty of canvas for imagination. It became a weather forecast, a political omen, even a personal horoscope. The flame spat today, someone might say, so my harvest will be thin. Another would counter, no, it smiled, so my daughter will marry well. The fire itself, silent and patient, gave no answers, and that silence was louder than words. The eternal fire of Chios had crossed the line from phenomenon into symbol. It was not merely about warmth or light, it was about meaning, and meaning, as every historian knows, is harder to extinguish than any flame. To this day, scholars pore over accounts, geologists test the soil, and folklorists scribble notes, all in search of clarity. Yet the fire resists clarity the way smoke resists being caught in a jar. The islanders may have shrugged at outsiders' fascination, but they also cherished it, because in the end, what is an island without a good story? The fire keeps burning, and the centuries lay meanings over it like soot on glass. By late antiquity, Greek and Roman minds give the hillside flame a scholarly frame. No longer just a roadside marvel to startle sailors or amuse shepherds, it becomes a phenomenon inviting careful explanation. Some writers claim subterranean winds feed it air from hidden caverns, whipping into fire as it squeezes through fissures. Others picture thin veins of sulphur or bitumen that seep and catch when the ground exhales. The schools disagree, warm their hands anyway, and write about it by whatever light the earth provides. Ancient authors help by listing several places where the ground itself burns, often reciting them as a set. Chios appears beside Lycia's hillside tongues, later called the Chimera, and near Apollonia's marsh lamps, mainstream proof that the wonder is not solitary, but part of a family of fiery landscapes. Priests and philosophers visit with equal curiosity, one calling it a sacred hearth, another event he can diagram with a stylus and a patient frown. Each leaves convinced the other missed the point, which is the timeless dignity of learned disagreement. The island folds the blaze into routine. Fishermen swear that smoke keeps biting flies at bay while they mend nets at dusk, and that is reason enough to sit close when the wind is kind. Vine growers joke that terraces downwind ripen earlier because even the soil likes to gossip with flames. At night, young couples climb the path and hold hands by the wavering glow, promising to love as long as the fire burns, which between us is a very practical contract if one hopes to postpone awkward conversations. Dawn returns the ledges to goats and lizards, and the promise converts as promises do into breakfast and chores. Quirky tidbits cling like burrs. A cook forgets his brazier and finds stew still bubbling where he set the pot above a vent. He swears the gods prefer lentils al dente. Boys dare one another to draw a thread across the tongue without scorching it. Grandmothers promising cakes to the bold and scolding the singed with equal affection. A travelling poet sells tiny clay lamps filled from the eternal source, and the island council, with the patience of saints, files them under souvenirs rather than sacraments. One fisherman keeps a coal in a lidded pot all winter, just in case the sky gets stingy, which is either thrift theatre or both. Scholars arrive with scrolls and confidence. One sketches a map of winds below the surface, a hidden bellows pumping breath through porous stone. Another quotes Hephaestus and adds a tidy diagram, gases seeping along faults, igniting where heat finds them in the open. They do not write methane, yet several come close in everything except vocabulary. A careful observer notes that rain sometimes dims the tongues for hours, and that pebbles tossed through them leave a smell not unlike pitch, an empirical nose tucked into myth. Historians still argue whether these proto-theories reflect genuine observation, or the agreeable habit of ancient writers to fit nature into elegant stories. Officials practical as millstones make space for marvel. A road crew bends the path around the hottest vent and sets smooth stones that catch the glow like beads. A tax clerk claims that increased illumination raises property values. Light joke, one tenant suggests that if the ledgers are so well lit, perhaps the tax could be easily found and burned. He tightens the numbers. They tighten their belts. The flame keeps a straight face. When a small quake opens a new fissure, a tidy notice appears: do not poke the earth with sticks. The children obey for almost 3 days, which might qualify as a miracle. Sailors add the blaze to sea law. On clear nights they steer by star and lighthouse. On cloudy ones they swear a faint blush above the island keeps them oriented a hearth for the horizon. A pilot claps a young helmsman's shoulder and says the fire tests courage stare too long, and you think your ship stands still and the world moves. Glance once and trust and you reach harbour. The lesson works for navigation, and awkwardly for politics. Somewhere in a tavern a captain jokes that if the flame ever goes out the island will have to hoist a very large lantern. Everyone laughs because no one wants to imagine the hillside dark. Church years arrive with hymns and caution. Bishops wary but practical frown at revels, yet borrow the warmth for winter vigils. A priest lifts a lamp, touches wick to the earth's tongue, and murmurs that the truest light comes from elsewhere. The faithful nod, grateful for both kinds of brightness. A monastic scribe notes that the fire of Chios burns even in rain, then amends it to often burns because accuracy is a virtue even when the margin is warm. The festivals change their hymns, but not the habit of stepping close and extending chilled hands. The ground trembles and the flame shifts. After a season of quakes, islanders find the old vent fading, and a new one flickering higher on the slope. Children declare the fire has gone walking. Elders say the mountain breathes like a sleeping grandparent. A careful overseer stakes the area with ropes to keep wanderers off soft crust. He ties knots by arm lengths and mutters that rules are just love tied to posts. Light joke too, his cousin suggests tying the goats instead. The goats decline the consultation and wander off with the dignity of tiny emperors. Travellers fold the sight into their gossip. A physician compares the scent to springs near Smyrna, and prescribes brief inhalations to clear thick humours, then coughs and prescribes fresh air. A perfumer traps smoke in jars and claims it lends mystery to resin. Buyers wrinkle noses and pronounce it memory instead. A visiting tax farmer proposes that if the flame is the earth's property, rents should flow to the treasury. The The islanders pour him wine strong enough to cancel his policy proposals before sunset. A paradox runs through it all. The more ordinary the flame seems to locals, the more extraordinary it looks to arrivals. Fables bloom. Some say the fire is a buried torch from an ancient hero. Others whisper that it marks the breath of a dragon pressed beneath the hill. Children keep both tales in one pocket the way they carry two figs, sticky, contradictory, perfectly balanced. Historians still argue whether the site's fame grows from reliable spectacle or from islanders with a genius for hospitality and timing. Practical minds keep tinkering. A mason lays bricks around the main vent to make a safer ring, discovering that the flame dances differently when wind funnels through the low wall. An enterprising baker slides thin dough across a warmed slab and learns it cooks quickly. Not miracle, just careful heat. Yet the first loaf goes to the shrine with a ribbon and a grin. Like joke 3, he swears the crust sings his name. His wife swears he's hearing his stomach and his pride harmonizing. The loaf disappears either way. Questions rustle like reeds no matter how many loaves are offered. Was the flame truly unbroken through the ages, or did caretakers nurse coals when storms smothered the breath? Do gases seep from faults tied to the same restless plates that rattle the Aegean, or from shallow pockets renewed by minerals and time? Did priests dramatize nature, or did nature cleverly hire priests as its publicists? The debates circle patient as moths fluttering at the edge of heat, and the fire answers only by continuing to be itself. What no one disputes is simpler than theory. On certain nights when wind hushes and the sky forgets clouds, a person can stand at the ledge and feel warmth on shins, smell resin and brine braided together, and hear the faint hiss where flame meets breath. Islanders shrug because marvels are tiring when they live next door. Travellers memorize the scene because marvels are medicine when they arrive at last. The flame keeps its counsel steady and slightly mischievous, older than rumour, younger than wonder. A small stubborn brightness that refuses to read anyone's footnotes and refuses to go to bed when told. The fifth act of the story carries us deeper into the paradox of flame that never fades. On the island of Chios, where breezes lift the scent of figs and olives, the eternal fire continues to burn as though no storm, no hand, no passing century can smother it. Sailors returning from voyages tell the same tale in taverns, a glow visible from the sea long before the coastline comes into focus. Some claim it comforts them like a beacon guiding them home, while others mutter that it feels more like a watchful eye, a reminder that the island keeps its own secrets. The fire, unchanging and untiring, becomes a companion to the rhythm of daily life, steady as the waves, insistent as hunger, and perplexing as a riddle that laughs at every attempt to solve it. A mainstream historical fact roots this account. Chios was no obscure backwater, but a prosperous Aegean island known for its mastic trade, the resin that flavoured wines and sweetened breath. Its wealth drew attention from Athens in the classical period and later from Rome and Byzantium empires that understood the value of an island whose exports filled both purses and stomachs. The fire therefore does not appear in a vacuum. It smoulders in the heart of a community with layers of political and economic significance. If the island's fortunes rose and fell on commerce, then this flame was its fixed point, a constant in the shifting tides of allegiance and tribute. One quirky tidbit whispers through medieval sources shepherds near the hills supposedly used the fire not merely for warmth or cooking, but as a kind of oracle. They would scatter herbs, fennel, thyme, and occasionally crushed garlic onto the flames and then read the smoke. Straight smoke meant calm weather for grazing, while curling plumes foretold storms. A more playful legend insists that a young man once threw his sweetheart's ribbon into the fire, only to see it burst into sparks shaped like a heart. Whether superstition or poetry, such tales reveal how ordinary people bent the mystery toward their own small hopes. Yet historians still argue whether the flame was ever natural at all. Some point toward natural gas seepage, a cousin to the fires of Mount Chimera, in Lycia, which has burned for millennia without human intervention. Others counter that there is no consistent geological evidence on Chios for such vents, and instead suggest that the fire was carefully maintained by generations of caretakers, monks, priests, or even secret guilds who kept watch. If so, the mystery is not why it burns, but why no record admits responsibility. To tend a flame for centuries is a heroic act of devotion, and yet the archives are silent. Did someone want the caretakers invisible, so that the fire itself appeared miraculous? Picture the fires setting a low stone enclosure blackened by centuries of soot, with walls patched and repatched like the hems of an old cloak. Around it, olive groves sway in the wind, their silver leaves shimmering as though imitating the flame's flicker. Children chase one another in the dust, daring each other to touch the warm stones, though parents scold them for disrespect. At night, the place takes on a different mood. Torches cast long shadows and pilgrims gather murmuring prayers. They toss small offerings, coins, fruit, even tiny carved figurines into the soil nearby, believing that generosity feeds the fire as surely as oil feeds a lamp. And always officials in distant cities try to make sense of it. In Constantinople, records mention the flame of Chios as a curiosity sometimes framed as divine approval of Byzantine rule, sometimes dismissed as pagan nonsense, tolerated only because it unsettled no one. In one document, a scribe compares it to the Vestal flame of Rome, remarking that both symbolize continuity, though he cannot resist adding that at least the Vestals received proper stipends. One can almost hear his bureaucratic envy leaking through the parchment. Humour inevitably seeps in even around something so solemn. One anecdote describes a group of merchants stranded on the island by a storm who roasted fish over the sacred fire, earning furious rebukes from locals. Their defence: they claim the gods surely enjoyed a well-cooked meal as much as men did. Another story, perhaps apocryphal, has a wandering monk warning that the fire would one day migrate to another island unless offered wine. The locals dutifully poured amphorae of their best vintage around the enclosure. The monk drank heartily, declared the flame satisfied, and promptly fell asleep beside it. As jokes go, it demonstrates that even holy mysteries attract opportunists with good appetites. The endurance of the flame also makes it a metaphor. For poets of the medieval Aegean, the Chian fire became shorthand for longing that would not die for grief, that could not be extinguished for a hope that burned through exile. One verse scratched into the plaster of a ruined chapel reads simply, "As the flame lives, so do I though all else fades." We cannot know who wrote it, but the handwriting is rough, perhaps the work of a soldier or a sailor rather than a scribe. Such small human traces tether the fire not just to theology or geology, but to lived emotion. Scholarly debates, folklore, political documents and jokes all swirl around the same stubborn fact: the flame burned, and it burned for centuries. Every attempt to pin it down slips away like smoke on the breeze. Was it God-sent? Was it geological? Was it human devotion disguised as miracle? The lack of clarity does not diminish its power, it amplifies it. The less one can prove, the more one imagines, and imagination has always been humanity's most durable fuel. And so the fire of Chios persists not merely in the chronicles of antiquity, or the whispers of Byzantine scribes, but in the minds of anyone who hears the story. As long as people crave mysteries that warm rather than frighten the flame, will continue to burn, whether in stone enclosures in village gossip, or in the quiet corners of bedtime stories like this one. Its glow is as much metaphor as reality, as much comfort as enigma, and it flickers tonight just as it did centuries ago, an unbroken light in a world full of shadows. The fire on Chios, that stubborn tongue of flame licking at stone and air, becomes more than a natural oddity, it becomes a cultural mirror. People do not only gather to warm their hands or cook their meals by it, they gather to craft meaning. Over time, the islanders fold the fire into their sense of identity, and visitors carry away stories that weave myth, religion and politics together into one glowing tapestry. The flame itself does not change much. It burns, it smokes its size, but the stories orbiting around it transform like clouds in a shifting sky. Each retelling adds a shade, a gesture, a claim of ownership. To speak of the fire is not to speak only of heat and fuel, but to speak of who rules, who prays, and who fears. Mainstream historical fact lends the scene a frame. Chios in antiquity was famed not only for this fire, but for its mastic resin, a valuable export prized across the Mediterranean. The resin hardened into fragrant beads used for chewing medicine, and even in rituals. When paired with the eternal flame, Chios gained a reputation as a place where earth and body conspired to create wonders. Merchants traded in mastic while glancing reverently toward the hill where the fire burned, muttering that the gods had clearly marked this island for attention. In a world where reputation mattered as much as raw grain or gold, Chios carried the aura of a place blessed and strange. Quirky tidbits always sprout in such fertile soil. One chronicler writing, with just enough exaggeration to be memorable, claimed that sailors carried small jars of ash from the Chios fire as charms against shipwreck, Another said Roman women powdered the ash into cosmetics, convinced it lent them an otherworldly glow, though whether the glow was beauty or rash is left politely unstated. The persistence of these tales reveals a deep human habit. When something resists explanation, we fold it into fashion, superstition, and commerce alike. The fire becomes not only heat, but an accessory, a product line, a whisper to tuck between one's teeth like mastic gum. Scholars still argue whether the persistence of the fire is geological natural gas venting from a crack in the island's crust, or cultural, maintained by generations of careful tending. This debate itself is telling because it shows how the line between nature and nurture blurs when the evidence is scarce. If the flame was entirely natural, then it reminds us how geology dictates human life. If it was cultural, kept alive by ritual hands, then it demonstrates how people long for continuity and invent permanence where none exists. The fire may be both a natural vent coaxed and preserved by human reverence. Consider the ceremonies layered onto this flame. Festivals on Chios sometimes included torch relays, runners carrying fire from the eternal source down into the town where it lit braziers and hearths. Families believed that a home flame kindled from the Eternal One would safeguard their fortunes, ensuring harvests and health. One legend even claims that newlywed couples would light their first shared lamp from it, a promise that their union burned with the blessing of gods as old as the earth. If you squint at it, you realise these customs are not so different from modern traditions. Who has not seen a wedding candle or a flame passed from one candle to another at a vigil? Humans cling to continuity by watching one fire touch another. In times of danger, the flame became a rallying point. During pirate raids, a hazard the Aegean knew all too well, villagers supposedly gathered around the fire as though its heat could shield them. Some versions of the tale suggest they smeared ash on their faces to appear fearsome, or to confuse attackers with a ghostly pallor. Imagine the sight: indigo and russet tunics in the flicker of flame faces smeared pale grey shadows dancing like armies on the stone walls. Whether the pirates laughed or fled, the detail lingers because it captures the way desperation makes theatre out of survival. The politics of empire layered new meanings onto the old fire. When Chios came under Byzantine control, Christian bishops frowned at the lingering pagan rituals around the flame, yet even they hesitated to extinguish it. To do so might anger the people, or worse, anger a god who could tolerate holy relics glowing in lamps, but not flames defying centuries. The compromise was a Christianized reinterpretation. The fire was recast as a natural wonder, allowed by divine providence, a beacon, reminding mortals of both creation's mystery and God's power. Pilgrims began to frame visits to Chios not as pagan devotion, but as acts of awe before the Creator's handiwork. In this reframing, the fire survived another round of cultural renovation. Light humour sneaks into these solemn frames. A medieval traveller, apparently unimpressed, once quipped that the eternal fire was simply proof that the cooks of Chios had forgotten how to douse their ovens. His companion retorted that at least it made finding dinner easier. Such jokes remind us that scepticism is as old as wonder, and every marvel attracts its share of eye-rolling pragmatists. Yet the joke itself confirms the fire's fame. If everyone knows of it, then everyone gets the joke. Through all of this, the eternal fire becomes less a physical phenomenon and more a palimpsest, a layered parchment where each generation scratches its version of the story atop the last. The Greeks inscribed divinity, the Romans etched commerce, the Byzantines pressed theology, and medieval travellers doodled sarcasm in the margins. What burns is not only methane or resin, but the human hunger to make sense of endurance. Fire is ephemeral by nature, yet here it is made into permanence, and that paradox refuses to stop glowing in the imagination. The villagers themselves, generation after generation, carry this flame not in scrolls or sermons, but in the rhythm of daily life. A child steals a coal to light a prank firecracker. An old woman mixes ash into poultices for aches, swearing it eases joints. A shepherd lights his pipe from it, chuckling that if he coughs, at least he coughs with sacred smoke. These vignettes, minor and unremarkable, sustain the larger narrative. Grand historians may argue in cloisters and universities, but the people of Chios keep the fire alive by simply living with it. Historians still argue whether we should treat the fire of Chios as a mythologized anecdote, or as evidence of how human memory anchors itself to physical phenomena. Yet regardless of which interpretation glows brighter, the tale illuminates something deeper, how people anchor themselves to continuity, even when the world is in flux. Empires rise, rulers fall, plagues sweep through, and yet a fire on a hill can whisper to a child that some things last. That whisper is not only comfort but a quiet rebellion against the chaos of history, and so rests with the image of a flame cradled not only by stone and air but by centuries of stories. The eternal fire of Chios is both literal and metaphorical feeding ovens, imaginations and debates alike. Its smoke curls into the sky, carrying laughter, reverence and uncertainty in equal measure. For now, the story lingers around it like villagers at dusk, leaning in for warmth, leaning in for meaning, never quite stepping away. The centuries do not dim the flame's hold on the imagination. Rather, they sharpen it into new shapes. By the time medieval chroniclers put quill to parchment, the eternal fire of Chios had already drifted beyond the neat boundaries of natural explanation. They describe it with the language of miracles and punishments, weaving theology into geology, the way a baker kneads honey into bread. A pilgrim stepping onto the island in the 12th century might not find miners or sailors whispering about hidden seams of gas, but monks and villagers pointing to the flame as proof of divine lessons. The fire became sermon symbol and signpost, all at once flickering not only against the night sky, but against the backdrop of medieval minds tuned to see meaning in every shadow. One mainstream fact anchors this phase of the story. Medieval Europeans often connected natural marvels with moral lessons. Volcanoes, earthquakes, and unquenchable fires were rarely described in neutral terms. Chroniclers saw them as rebukes from heaven or portents of future events. So the fire of Chios slotted neatly into this worldview, instead of being discussed as gas seeping from the earth, an explanation that would wait for much later centuries. It was written about as a punishment for sins or a reminder of God's constant presence. In some texts, the flame was likened to the burning bush of Exodus, unconsumed yet eternally alive. To live near such a phenomenon was not merely geography, it was theology underfoot. A quirky tidbit slips through the pages of one obscure chronicle. A monk claimed the fire once dimmed for a day and a night only to flare brighter after villagers held a procession with icons and incense. The claim is almost certainly embroidered, but the imagery stuck. Imagine villagers in saffron and indigo tunics, trudging with candles through dark streets, while the earth's own candle sulked beneath their feet, only to reward them with renewed blaze. It is half miracle play, half campfire tale, and exactly the sort of story that anchors itself in memory long after parchment fades. Historians still argue whether these accounts are echoes of real fluctuations in the gas flow or pure invention. After all, even a flame that burns for centuries can sputter under wind or rain. Yet the medieval imagination was quick to take ordinary interruptions and elevate them into cosmic drama. In their telling, Chios did not simply host a natural oddity. It cradled a direct conversation with the Divine One that spoke through flicker and smoke instead of syllables. Picture the island's harbour under the moon. Sailors unload amphorae of wine-salt fish and fragrant resin, while above them on a distant slope, the steady orange glow wavers in the breeze. Some sailors cross themselves at the sight, muttering that such a light is unnatural. Others see it as a beacon promising safety the way a lighthouse might. That dual reading omen or aid mirrors the way medieval society itself grappled with marvels. Were they gifts? Were they warnings? Or were they cheekily just reminders that God had a flair for dramatic lighting? The fire crept into politics too. Medieval rulers occasionally sought to claim association with wonders. If your territory housed a relic, a saint's shrine, or a miracle of nature, you gained prestige. The Byzantine emperors had their Hagia Sophia. Lesser princes had their holy springs. Chios had its flame. There is speculation, though not proven, that local lords encouraged pilgrims to see the fire as wholly a kind of branding exercise for a medieval tourism economy. Light joke 1. Imagine a medieval billboard reading "Visit Chios, come for the mastic gum, stay for the eternal fire." If monks could sell badges from saints' shrines, why not tales of an endless blaze? Meanwhile, scholars scribbling in Constantinople and beyond filed the fire into broader compendia of marvels. One Byzantine encyclopedia lists it alongside tales of fountains that spurt wine and rivers that run backward during eclipses. The company is telling. The fire was not isolated, but part of a catalogue of wonders that shaped how medieval minds measured the world's strangeness. By being recorded, it was granted permanence. By being embroidered, it was granted power. The flame also became a metaphor in sermons. Preachers compared it to the soul that must burn continuously with faith, never extinguished by temptation or sin. Congregations nodded, some out of conviction, some out of habit, and perhaps a few because they were imagining dinner rather than doctrine. Still, the image held. To link the fire of Chios with the inner fire of devotion was a neat trick, turning geology into theology with a single flourish of rhetoric. Skeptics, of course, never vanish completely. A handful of travellers reported that the flame was less impressive than rumour suggested, a mere flicker rather than a tower of fire. Their accounts are quieter, less dramatic, and consequently less remembered. But even their disappointment tells us something: expectation had already inflated the legend. When reality failed to match, the legend adjusted itself upward anyway. As one cynical traveller might mutter, well, if it doesn't impress in person, it impresses in parchment. Light joke, 2 medieval travel reviews would probably read like 2 stars would not pilgrim again. The fire's presence also shaped folklore closer to home. Local mothers warned children not to wander too close, or the earth would swallow them as it fed the flame. Fishermen joked that the fire heated the sea and made the fish cook themselves, which would have been convenient if only it were true. A tavern tale claimed that coins thrown into the blaze melted instantly, a divine test of greed. Such stories reveal a culture folding the phenomenon into everyday life, seasoning fact with fancy, the way cooks season stew with herbs. One curious debate among scholars touches on whether the fire influenced Chios' reputation for resilience. The island, repeatedly invaded and traded between empires, was seen as stubbornly enduring despite hardship. Did the eternal flame become a symbol of that resilience, a kind of fiery mascot that reassured people that no matter the turmoil, something constant still burned? Historians still argue whether this symbolic association was deliberate or subconscious, but the possibility glimmers like heat haze on stone. As night deepens in our narrative, imagine the scene once more: a medieval scribe bent over parchment, by lamplight scratching lines about a fire that never dies. Outside, the real fire flickers in the hills, stubborn against wind, rain, and the march of years. Inside, his ink preserves not the flame itself, but the way it was seen, fearful, hopeful, moral, miraculous. The scribe coughs in the smoke of his lamp and mutters that truth is harder to pin than flame. Like joke 3, he probably also muttered that lamp oil was more expensive than paper, proving that some medieval complaints sound suspiciously modern, and so closes with the fire firmly lodged in medieval imagination. No longer just a curiosity on a Greek island, it is a moral compass, a political tool, a tourist attraction, and a metaphor for the unquenchable. Whether or not the flame ever dimmed, it blazed brightly in the minds of those who wrote about it, and that perhaps is why the story survives, carried forward not only by heat but by hope. The eternal fire of chaos refuses to stay confined to borders drawn on ancient maps or etched in parchment. By this stage of the story, it has wandered into the hearts of poets, philosophers, mystics, and more than a few schemers who see in the flames not just a natural curiosity but a stage on which to act out ambition. The Greeks, never short on imagination, let the fire seep into their theatre, their debates, their travelling lore, and even their mischievous practical jokes. What began as a simple flicker in the earth had become over centuries a lantern that illuminated far more than the rocks and sands of its island home. It became a symbol, and symbols are dangerous things, both too fragile to bear the weight of empires and too stubborn to be snuffed out by mere practicality. One mainstream fact needs to be set down clearly before wandering further: Greek theatre did not shy away from fire, both literal and metaphorical. In tragedies staged in Athens, audiences were accustomed to gods arriving on stage in mechanical cranes, thunder simulated by rolling stones in hollow vessels, and flames carefully contained in bronze basins. Fire was already part of the language of performance, and when tales from Chios spoke of a flame that burned without ceasing, playwrights were quick to make it metaphor for passion, vengeance, or divine will. Aristophanes, known for his biting wit, never passed up the chance to mock the pretensions of philosophers, and one lost fragment reportedly jokes that philosophers debating the Chian flame would argue so long that the fire itself might grow bored and walk away. Even if apocryphal, the jest captures how quickly the flame slipped into the cultural bloodstream. The fire also attracted those philosophers themselves who are never satisfied to leave a phenomenon unexplored, Imagine a small circle of men in indigo and russet cloaks huddled around their lamps in a stoa at night, muttering about whether the Chian flame proved the universe eternal or simply gas seeping from some disgruntled cavern. Historians still argue whether Stoics or Epicureans took the matter more seriously, but what records suggest is that both sides used the fire as evidence for their broader worldviews. For Stoics, the flame hinted at a divine logos sustaining the cosmos. For Epicureans, it was a neat geological quirk easily explained and filed away proof that not every mystery required God's meddling. Yet even they could not resist retelling the story, because like all good puzzles, the fire carried just enough ambiguity to keep tongues wagging. Quirky tidbits sprouted wherever stories of the fire travelled. A merchant from Rhodes, already prone to exaggerating the weight of his goods, claimed to have lit his pipe on Chios once, and found it burned for 3 days without needing relighting, his audience presumably rolling their eyes but still half curious whether it might be true. Sailors joked that the fire was a divine lighthouse, and if a captain could just bottle some of it, storms would never find him again. One even bragged that he had stolen a jar of the eternal flame only for the jar to explode spectacularly mid-voyage, which was either a fine warning against hubris or an early demonstration of why transporting gases without understanding pressure is a terrible idea. Meanwhile, religion continued to lend the fire an aura of sacred defiance. Pilgrims left offerings at the site, small clay figurines, scraps of saffron-dyed cloth, tiny iron charms shaped like serpents. A few desperate souls even carried coals from the fire homeward, believing it would ward off illness or ensure fertility. Whether these embers survived the journey intact is doubtful, but the belief shows how the eternal flame became entwined with daily hopes and fears. The flame was not merely a spectacle, it was a participant in life sitting invisibly at tables and hearths far beyond Chios itself. Of course, politicians could not resist turning the fire into currency of a different kind. A local governor once boasted to Rome that his island had a flame burning longer than any Roman torch, a claim intended less as scientific statement than as subtle advertisement. Send us more trade, for we sit upon wonders. Whether the Roman bureaucrats believed him is unclear, but the strategy was not foolish. Wonders have a way of drawing ships' coins and stories alike, and in a Mediterranean world where bread oil and spectacle formed the lifeblood of politics, even a lonely flame on a rocky island could be spun into leverage. Historians still argue whether Chios ever formally staged festivals around its fire akin to the Panathenaic celebrations in Athens or the torch races of Sparta. No firm inscription survive, but scattered references suggest that processions may have wound toward the flame with saffron-clad youths bearing garlands and priests intoning verses that likened the fire to divine constancy. One fragment describes dancers circling a flame while balancing amphorae of oil on their heads, a feat both devotional and comically precarious. The image, half solemn and half circus, embodies perfectly the way sacred and playful often mingled in Greek ritual. In quieter corners, however, the fire inspired reflection more than revelry. Poets penned verses likening human love to the eternal flame always burning, never sated, sometimes scorching. Philosophers returning from Chios scribbled in their notebooks about natural law, and one eccentric mystic claimed the flame sang if you listened at midnight, though what it sang he never wrote down. Another traveller, perhaps with too much wine, insisted the fire flickered in time with his heartbeat, a claim both medically implausible and strangely touching. Such tales show how the flame served as a canvas onto which human imagination projected its fears, loves, and absurdities. By the later centuries of the Greek and Byzantine world, the fire had become so layered with meanings that one could scarcely see the flame itself through the cloud of interpretations. Was it a divine signal, a geological accident, a metaphor waiting to be borrowed by every ambitious writer? It was all of these, and the lack of consensus kept the story alive. Silence, after all, kills a mystery. Contradiction preserves it. Just as sailors once swore they saw phantom fleets in the moonlight, so too did citizens continue to swear by the Chian flame, each in their own way. And here perhaps the greatest joke hides. For while emperors tried to measure their reigns in monuments, while philosophers tried to measure their thoughts in systems, while merchants tried to measure their worth in coin, the people of Chios quietly lived beside a fire that measured nothing at all, only persistence. It burned on untroubled by politics, theology, or gossip. The fire did not care if it was a Stoic symbol or an Epicurean inconvenience. It did not flicker differently when praised or mocked. It simply continued while humans spun endless webs around it. The debate over the eternal fire of Chios does not stop in the ancient or medieval world. It flows into the age of modern scholarship, where academics in their libraries, laboratories and lecture halls wrangle with the same elusive flames that baffled sailors, monks and poets before them. The quiet irony is that the fire which burned so noisily in the hills has generated just as much heat in the arguments of those who tried to explain it. Archaeologists dig, chemists test, classicists translate, and yet the fire continues to resist simple categorization. It remains more than a local curiosity, more than a natural oddity. It is a mirror of how humans approach mystery itself. The first step for modern scholars was naturally to seek material explanations. Geologists have noted that the island of Chios lies along a tectonic fault line. Gas vents, they propose, may have leaked methane or other flammable vapours from deep strata, and once ignited, whether by lightning, volcanic spark or human hand, the seepage could burn for years, even centuries. This sounds tidy, like an elegant equation scrawled across a blackboard. Yet as always, the devil hides in the details. If methane vents are so abundant, why did no other Aegean island report a flame as persistent? Historians still argue whether the geology of Chios was truly unique, or whether eyewitnesses embroidered scattered incidents into one perpetual legend. One mainstream fact anchors this investigation: natural eternal flames do exist. Even today, places from Turkey to Iraq to New York State boast burning springs or eternal flames where natural gas seeps to the surface and ignites. Pilgrims and tourists alike gather to gawk at fire that does not die. It proves that the concept is not fantasy. Nature can and does stage such spectacles. The Chios flame then fits within a wider catalogue of fiery marvels. But the challenge is timing. Did such vents exist on Chios in antiquity? And if so, where are they now? Modern surveys of the island have failed to pinpoint a living vent, leaving scholars with the possibility that erosion earthquakes or human activity sealed them long ago. The flame may have been real, but its stage has been dismantled. Archaeologists searching for physical traces sometimes resemble treasure hunters with magnifying glasses. One quirky tidbit emerges from a 19th century traveller's account. He claimed to find blackened stones in a hillside cave that locals swore once sheltered the sacred fire. Whether these were genuine remnants of combustion or simply soot from shepherds' torches is uncertain, but the discovery thrilled imaginations. Later expeditions carried jars to capture any whiff of lingering gas. None succeeded, though one professor wryly reported that his students almost fainted from the exertion of sniffing every crack in the cliff face. It is the kind of absurd scene that shows how even serious science occasionally borders on comedy. Meanwhile, philologists, those tireless detectives of language, turn to the texts. They examine how ancient writers describe the flame passing every adjective, comparing metaphors, tracing vocabulary across centuries. Was the fire described as continuous or seasonal? Did poets exaggerate for effect? A debate emerges around whether the term used in certain manuscripts meant eternal in the literal sense or simply long-lasting. Historians still argue whether mistranslations have made the fire seem more miraculous than it was. If the sources only meant persistent or remarkably enduring, then centuries of speculation may rest on a single slippery word. Yet not all modern interpreters are content with geology and grammar. Some approach the Chios fire through anthropology and folklore. Fire cults, they note, recur worldwide. From Zoroastrian temples in Persia to sacred hearths in Rome, flames carried spiritual weight. Perhaps the Chios fire was less about geology and more about ritual. Islanders could have maintained a man-made flame for generations, feeding it with resin oil or pitch, and later generations mistook its longevity for natural miracle. This theory has the virtue of explaining why no gas vent remains, but it raises its own doubts. Who would have tended such a fire, and why has no inscription or altar survived to confirm the custom? The silence of the material record leaves the question dangling. At academic conferences, these rival theories clash like gladiators in polite togas. One camp waves charts of tectonic activity. Another brandishes lexicons. Another shrugs and says that myths grow legs of their own. Like joke one, a weary graduate student once quipped that the eternal fire of Chios now burns brightest only in the coffee cups of professors arguing past midnight. The laughter, though rueful, acknowledged a truth: sometimes the mystery fuels careers more effectively than it fuels lamps. The debate spills outward into popular imagination as well. Travel writers of the 20th century eager for colour repeated the old tales with fresh flourishes. One described the fire as visible even to passing ships, though no sailor of his acquaintance had ever seen it. Another claimed local children played games around phantom flames, daring each other to whisper secrets into cracks in the earth. These anecdotes read more like postcards than science, yet they prove that the allure of the story persisted. People love a good unsolved puzzle, especially one that glows in the dark. Modern technology tempts some to dream of resolution. Could ground-penetrating radar or chemical sampling uncover the ancient vent? Could divers find evidence of underwater gas seeps feeding the legend? Teams occasionally attempt such surveys, but the results remain inconclusive. The island's terrain is complex, its history layered. Each earthquake rewrites the map, each human construction erases traces. The eternal fire may be hiding in plain sight, or it may have died a quiet death centuries ago. Either way, the absence of proof has become part of the legend itself, and so the conversation loops back, circling like a tide that refuses to recede. Scholars propose counter-refine, and yet the flame remains elusive, flickering between science and story. A mainstream historian once summed it up: the eternal fire of Chios tells us less about geology than about how humans narrate uncertainty. That perhaps is the heart of Section 9, the recognition that mystery itself can be productive, sparking debates that reveal more about us than about the flame. Light joke too, if the Romans had had peer-reviewed journals, one imagines the title on the perpetual fire of Chios, followed by 20 pages of polite disagreement, and a final note that further study is required. In some ways, that is exactly what modern research looks like. The narrative, still unbroken, drifts toward its final cadence. The eternal fire of Chios has burned in text, in legends, in jokes, and in scholarly articles. Its actual fuel gas seep oil lamp, divine whim, matters less than its endurance in human imagination. Historians still argue whether it was fact fiction or a fusion of both, but their arguments themselves have become part of the fire's glow. What began as a flicker in the hills of an Aegean island now illuminates the endless appetite humans have for mystery. Light joke 3 slides in like a wink before the curtain. Someone once suggested that the eternal fire went out only because it grew tired of being peer-reviewed. If so, one cannot blame it. Flames like freedom, after all. The story nears its end not with a spark of certainty, but with the gentle glow of mystery that refuses to be extinguished. The eternal fire of Chios, whether blazing bright on a hillside, or flickering quietly in the imagination of scholars and sailors, has carried its warmth across centuries. What began as whispers of a flame that would not die has grown into a parable about the fragility of empires, the persistence of rumour, and the strange resilience of human curiosity. At its heart, one mainstream fact anchors everything Rome and later Byzantium depended heavily on: steady flows of grain and maritime security. When supplies faltered, people turned quickly to stories to fill the gaps. The eternal fire became more than an isolated marvel, it was a symbol, a shorthand for the dangerous balance between plenty and scarcity. When fire was steady, life was steady. When flame vanished, so too did comfort. The association between flame and fortune ran deep in the Mediterranean world, and Chios became a stage upon which this connection burned itself into legend. As centuries passed, the tale took on layers. Some swore the flame was a divine beacon placed by the gods to watch over sailors. Others insisted it was a natural wonder, a vent of the earth itself. Still others spun quirky tidbits, imagining that the fire was a jealous guardian who demanded nightly songs from passing villagers, or that sailors could see ghostly figures dancing around it on feast days. None of these embellishments were proven, but they added texture to the way the story grew. Historians still argue whether such layers arose from genuine memory or later invention. Yet the layering itself is revealing. When people face uncertainty, they decorate it until it becomes bearable. The fire's echo was strong enough to reach the medieval imagination. Crusaders marching through the Aegean scribbled notes about fires that burned without wood. Byzantine chroniclers compared the Chios flame to their own weaponized wonder Greek fire, as if one miracle demanded to be measured against another. Merchants weary from storms took it as an omen that their voyage was protected, and peasants baking bread in clay ovens repeated old sayings that the fire of Chios burned so long because it was fed by the breath of saints. The eternal fire thus bridged sacred and mundane science and superstition. In modern times, the flame has become a metaphor for endurance. Writers speak of it when describing the stubbornness of islanders who withstood pirates' plagues and earthquakes. Teachers invoke it when explaining the persistence of myths in shaping historical memory. And yes, even travel brochures dust off the legend promising visitors the chance to stand on the same soil where an ancient flame once danced. The flame may no longer blaze, but it continues to fuel stories which in turn fuel curiosity. Light joke 1, if the eternal fire had charged admission, it might have outlasted even the most secure empire by sheer financial stability. After all, people will always pay to stare at something they can't explain, but the absence of the flame matters as much as its presence. There is no shrine to visit, no flicker to warm one's hands. What remains is absence wrapped in memory. Scholars sift through words, not ashes. Archaeologists search for soot, not smoke. Tourists seek a hill that no longer burns. And in that gap lies the greatest lesson. Sometimes what matters most in history is not what we can measure, but what we continue to imagine. This is why the eternal fire of Chios sits so comfortably among bedtime mysteries. It does not demand resolution. It offers instead a gentle acknowledgement that the past is not always cooperative, that empires rise and fall, and that some questions are healthiest when left open. To trace the fire is to trace the human need to explain, to believe, and to laugh in the dark. Light joke 2 drifts in like a yawn. One weary Roman official supposedly suggested that if the fire really was eternal, they should just ship it to Rome and use it to light all the street lamps. Imagine the savings. And so the flame, whether real or imagined, still burns. Not in the hills of Chios, perhaps, but in stories told at night in books stacked on shelves, and in the quiet glow of curiosity that lights up listeners drifting towards sleep. Its persistence is not in heat, but in narrative. In that sense, the eternal fire has fulfilled its promise. It has outlived empires, and it still keeps company with anyone willing to listen. Now the narration softens, stretching into the wind down. The images blur like a dream that knows it is ready to close. The fire fades into mist, the amphorae of grain dissolve into shadows, the scholars lower their quills. The sea itself exhales in long, patient breaths, its surface smoothing into silver beneath the moon. The urgency that once clung to breadlines and burning hills loosens into calm. The listener is invited to follow that calm. Imagine lying on the shore of Chios, the night warm, but quiet waves lapping in rhythm with your breath. No flame is visible now, only the memory of one, and even that memory begins to soften. What mattered centuries ago drifts away, what felt urgent dissolves into quiet, and only the hush of the present remains. Breathing slows with the sea's cadence in like a tide that rises, out like a tide that falls. Each moment grows longer, each thought lighter. The fire that once unsettled now soothes. It has become a lullaby without words, a comfort that warmth still exists, even if only in imagination. And as the voice dims, the fire of Chios is left where it belongs, glowing not in stone or soil, but in the gentle corners of the mind where dreams take shape. The empire that worried the sailors who feared the scholars who argued all are at rest. The story, like the tide, ebbs into silence. Light joke 3 whispers one last smile. Maybe the eternal fire simply burned itself out, waiting for historians to agree. And perhaps that's not such a bad ending. So let the night fold in softly. Let questions drift into the dark, not lost, but resting. Sleep comes now steady as the waves, and the eternal fire guides you not with answers, but with calm.